Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today, I'm going to show you how to dye your shoes a different color at home. This is a really fun and easy way to give your old shoes a new lease on life, and it's a lot cheaper than buying new shoes. In this video, I'll walk you through the entire process step by step, from gathering the supplies to applying the dye. I'll also give you some tips on how to choose the right dye for your shoes and how to avoid common mistakes. So, if you're ready to give your shoes a makeover, let's get started. To dye your leather shoes at home, you'll need a few essential tools and materials. Dye: choose a leather dye specifically formulated for the type of leather your shoes are made from. Acetone or rubbing alcohol: this will be used to clean and prep the shoes before dyeing. Rubber gloves: protect your hands from the dye. Paintbrush or sponge: apply the dye evenly. Paper towels or rags: clean up spills and drips. Petroleum jelly: protect the soles and other areas you don't want dyed. Drop cloth or plastic sheeting: protect your work surface. A well-ventilated area: the fumes from the dye can be harmful, so work in a space with good air circulation. Before you start dyeing, it's important to prepare your shoes properly. Here's what you need to do: clean the shoes thoroughly. Use a damp cloth with a mild soap solution to remove any dirt or debris. Remove the laces and any other removable parts. Stuff the shoes with newspaper or paper towels to help them keep their shape. Use acetone or rubbing alcohol to clean the leather surface. This will remove any oils or residues that could prevent the dye from adhering properly. Apply petroleum jelly to the soles and any other areas you don't want dyed. Now that your shoes are prepped, it's time to start dyeing. Follow these steps. Pour the dye into a container. Dip the paintbrush or sponge into the dye and apply it to the shoes in thin, even coats. Start with the seams and edges, then move on to the larger surfaces. Allow the dye to dry completely between coats. This may take several hours, depending on the type of dye you're using. Apply additional coats of dye until you achieve the desired color. Once the dye is dry, remove the newspaper or paper towels from the shoes. Clean up any spills or drips with a damp cloth. Let the shoes air out for 24 hours before wearing them. Dyeing white leather shoes can be a bit trickier than dyeing other colors. The white leather may absorb the dye more readily, resulting in a darker color than you intended. To avoid this, you can try diluting the dye with water or using a lighter shade of dye. You may also need to apply more coats of dye to achieve the desired color. Dyeing suede shoes requires a slightly different approach than dyeing leather shoes. Suede is a more delicate material, so you'll need to use a special suede dye. You'll also need to be careful not to oversaturate the suede, as this can damage the material. Here are some additional tips for dyeing suede shoes. Use a soft bristled brush to apply the dye. Work in small sections, and apply the dye in a circular motion. Allow the dye to dry completely between coats. Brush the suede with a suede brush to restore its texture. Dyeing your leather shoes at home is a relatively easy and inexpensive way to give them a new look. By following the steps outlined in this guide, you can achieve professional-looking results without breaking the bank. Just be sure to choose the right dye for your type of leather and follow the instructions carefully. First, let's talk about dyeing textile shoes. This is the most common type of shoe to dye, and it's also the easiest. You'll need a few things to get started: a pair of textile shoes. RIT dye in the color of your choice. A large pot or bucket. Rubber gloves. A plastic drop cloth. Salt. Once you have your supplies, follow these steps. Clean your shoes thoroughly with a damp cloth. Fill the pot or bucket with enough hot water to cover the shoes. Add the RIT dye to the water, following the instructions on the package. Add a cup of salt to the water. This will help the dye set better. Put on your rubber gloves and carefully place the shoes in the dye bath. Let the shoes soak in the dye for at least 30 minutes, or longer for a more intense color. Remove the shoes from the dye bath and rinse them thoroughly with cold water until the water runs clear. Let the shoes air dry completely before wearing them. Dyeing rubber boots is a bit more challenging than dyeing textile shoes, but it's still possible. You'll need to use a special type of dye called Angelus leather dye. You can find this dye at most craft stores. Here's how to dye rubber boots. Clean the boots thoroughly with a damp cloth. Apply a thin coat of Angelus leather preparer and deglazer to the boots. This will help the dye adhere to the rubber. Let the preparer dry completely. Apply a thin coat of Angelus leather dye to the boots. Use a sponge or brush to apply the dye evenly. Let the dye dry completely. Apply a second coat of dye, if necessary. Let the dye dry completely. Apply a coat of Angelus acrylic finisher to the boots. This will help protect the dye and make the boots water resistant. Dyeing heels and soles can be tricky, as they are often made of different materials than the rest of the shoe. However, it is possible to dye them with a little care. Here's how to dye heels and soles. Clean the heels and soles thoroughly with a damp cloth. Apply a thin coat of Angelus leather preparer and deglazer to the heels and soles. Let the preparer dry completely. Apply a thin coat of Angelus leather dye to the heels and soles. Use a sponge or brush to apply the dye evenly. Let the dye dry completely. Apply a second coat of dye, if necessary. Let the dye dry completely. Apply a coat of Angelus acrylic finisher to the heels and soles. This will help protect the dye and make them water resistant. Once you've dyed your shoes, it's important to take proper care of them to keep the color looking its best. Here are a few tips. Avoid getting your shoes wet. If they do get wet, dry them immediately with a clean cloth. Don't wear your shoes in the rain or snow. Don't expose your shoes to direct sunlight. Clean your shoes regularly with a damp cloth. If your shoes start to fade, you can re-dye them using the same steps as above. Dyeing your shoes is a great way to give them a new lease on life. With a little care, you can keep your dyed shoes looking great for years to come.